Tuesday, May 8, 1945, Munich, Bavaria, Germany. Leisel Hartmann, a 23-year-old woman, bent over a cracked porcelain basin as the smell of gunpowder still hung in the spring air. Soot streaked her hollow cheeks. The cold of melted snow seeped through the worn soles of her shoes. Through the shattered window of her third-floor apartment, she watched olive-painted jeeps roll down Sonnenstraße, their white stars gleaming against the drab ruins. Her hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the contradiction unfolding below. She had been told they were monsters. The radio broadcasts had been clear. Americans would burn, torture, enslave. The posters plastered across Munich showed grotesque caricatures, fanged faces, clawed hands reaching for German children. Yet there, in the rubble-strewn street, she watched a boy in an oversized uniform crouch beside a small girl and press a brown square into her palm. Chocolate. The child's mother pulled her back, suspicious, but the soldier only smiled, tired, almost sad, and walked away. How could men who had flattened cities still smile like that? Leisel thought, her fingers gripping the windowsill until her knuckles whitened. The before picture. Leisel had lived through the war in Munich, watching her city transform from a place of beer gardens and summer festivals into a fortress of sandbags and air raid sirens. Her father, a postal clerk, had died in the bombing of '44. Her younger brother, Franz, barely 19, had fallen at Kursk in the summer of '43, his last letter home filled with propaganda about inevitable victory. By the time the Americans arrived, Leisel weighed barely 45 kilograms, her monthly civilian ration reduced to a mockery: 250 grams of bread per day, 62.5 grams of fat per week, no coffee for 3 years. The propaganda had been relentless. Every radio broadcast, every poster, every whispered conversation in the breadlines reinforced the same message. The Americans were Untermenschen in uniforms, destroyers who would show no mercy, who would violate and enslave, who represented everything barbaric about the West. She had believed it because believing required less courage than doubting. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was the scale of the disparity they were about to witness. German civilian weekly ration, 1945, 1,750 grams of bread, 437 grams of potatoes, 62.5 grams of fat. American K-ration single meal, 3,000 calories, including canned meat, biscuits, chocolate, cigarettes, and instant coffee. German soap production per capita, 1945, virtually none. Civilians used ash and sand. American PX supplies per soldier monthly, unlimited access to Ivory soap, Colgate toothpaste, Gillette razors. German nylon stocking availability, non-existent since 1940, women drew lines up their legs with eyebrow pencil. American nylon production, 1945, 300 million pairs annually, common GI trade goods. German coffee consumption, 1945, ersatz made from acorns and chicory. American coffee ration per soldier daily, real coffee, unlimited refills at mess halls. She had been trained for hate. What Leisel didn't know was that a simple cup of coffee was about to begin the long lesson of relearning tenderness. First contact, the knock. It came 3 days after the surrender, a knock, firm but not violent, on her apartment door. Leisel stood frozen in her kitchen, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the thin wood, she could hear boots shifting on the landing. Not the sharp click of German military heels, but the softer scuff of American rubber soles. Her hand hovered over the doorknob. Every instinct screamed danger. Every poster she'd seen flashed through her mind. Clawed hands, monstrous faces, unspeakable intentions. She opened the door. The soldier standing there was soaked from the spring rain. His uniform hung loose on a frame that suggested he'd once been larger. His eyes, pale blue, ringed with exhaustion, met hers without command or threat. He couldn't have been more than 22. In his hands, he held a dented tin can. "Ma'am," he said slowly, his German fractured and apologetic, coffee, warm?" She stared at him, at his tired eyes, at the rain dripping from his helmet, at the tin can in his hands, stamped with English words she couldn't read. The propaganda had shown monsters with grotesque, inhuman faces, but this was just a boy, weary and drenched, offering her something from his own rations. It must be a trick, she thought. He wants something. Information. Compliance? Worse. Yet he only stood there, waiting, the rain tapping against the broken window behind her. Her voice cracked from disuse. I have no cup. He smiled, a small, sad expression, and produced a battered metal mug from his pack. Then he stepped back, as if to give her space, to show he meant no intrusion. The gesture was so unexpected that Leisel found herself nodding. He poured the coffee there in the hallway, steam rising into the cold air. The smell hit her first, rich, dark, real, a scent she hadn't known in 3 years. It overwhelmed everything, the gunpowder, the must of her apartment, the ash that clung to every surface. When he handed her the mug, the warmth against her cold palms felt almost violent in its intensity. She sipped. The taste was bitter, black, scorching, and the most real thing she'd experienced since before the war. Her throat tightened. Not from the heat, but from the sudden, crushing weight of contrast. This small kindness against the backdrop of total ruin. He didn't speak again, just nodded, turned, and walked back down the stairs, his boots echoing in the empty stairwell. Leisel stood in her doorway, holding the empty mug, her entire ideology cracking like the porcelain basin in her kitchen. Later, when her friend Marta came by, she saw the mug on the table. "They'll leave when the orders come," Marta whispered, her eyes hard with suspicion. "And you'll be the one left behind with shame. Everyone saw him knock on your door. They're already talking." Leisel said nothing, but the warmth of that coffee cup lingered in her memory like a forbidden prayer. The accumulation of evidence. By late May, Private James O'Donnell had returned 4 times, never with demands. Only with small gifts that seemed insignificant to him, but were revolutionary to her. A bar of ivory soap, still wrapped in paper, a tin of corned beef, a package of Wrigley's chewing gum for the children in her building. Each visit was technically a crime. War Department Circular number 155, issued in September 1944, explicitly forbade non-fraternization with German civilians. The policy was clear: no socializing, no unnecessary conversation, no relationship beyond official business. Violators faced court-martial, yet James kept coming. One GI wrote to his mother during this period, historians would later note, "They look like us, they just lost too much." That sentiment was spreading through the ranks faster than official policy could contain it. By late 1945, military police recorded thousands of fraternization incidents daily. Commanders soon realized that hearts could not be rationed like ammunition. One evening in June, James arrived at the makeshift field kitchen where Leisel had found work peeling potatoes for the American mess. He came to trade, bred for stories he couldn't understand, practiced German phrases for her patient corrections. They sat on overturned crates stamped with white stars, and he produced a small portable radio. Glenn Miller's orchestra leaked through the tinny speaker, a sound so utterly foreign that Leisel couldn't help but smile. "You like?" he asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "It's loud." "That's the point." His grin was easy, unguarded. "Makes you forget for a while." The music did something to the air between them. It filled the silence that her limited English and his broken German couldn't bridge. When he left that night, he pressed something soft into her hands, a pair of nylon stockings still in the package. Leisel stared at them, remembering Marta's warnings. But James's gaze held no expectation, no demand for payment, only a simple desire to give. In that moment, the whispers of her neighbors, the accusations of improper conduct, the sidelong glances, faded into irrelevance. Leisel later recalled, she would tell an interviewer in the 1950s, the gift wasn't about vanity, it was about dignity. In a world where everything was taken, something soft and new against my skin felt like permission to be human again. By late summer, the small acts had multiplied into a pattern she could no longer ignore. James helped her lift heavy kettles at the field kitchen without being asked. He shared his sea rations when she worked through lunch. He never gave orders, never raised his voice, never demonstrated the brutality she'd been taught to expect. The transformation wasn't instant. It was incremental, built on moments. The afternoon he stood between her and a drunken sergeant who'd made comments, his quiet, firm intervention. The morning he brought extra blankets for the children's shelter she'd mentioned in passing. The evening he taught her to say thank you in English, laughing when she mispronounced it as "sank you." Each gesture was a crime of compassion under military law. Each shared silence at the field kitchen chipped away at the wall of certainty she'd built from years of propaganda. The irony wasn't lost on Leisel. The monstrous conquerors offered chocolate to children. The forbidden act of fraternization became the first act of reconstruction. The Schokoladensoldaten, chocolate soldiers, as German women half-mockingly, half-yearningly called them, were rebuilding more than bridges and roads. They were rebuilding the possibility of trust. By autumn, as the leaves turned gold over Munich's ruins, James had been transferred to Bremen for demobilization processing. Leisel thought she'd never see him again. The brief, bright interval of kindness was over, just as Marta had predicted. Then the letter arrived. The breaking point. It came in October, forwarded through the Red Cross. The envelope was thin, the paper cheap military issue. Inside, James's handwriting was careful, almost childlike. Dear Leisel, I don't know if you'll get this. I don't know if you'll write back, but I've been thinking about those evenings at the field kitchen, about your smile when you heard Glenn Miller for the first time, about how you never asked me for anything, even when you needed everything. They're passing a law, the War Brides Act they're calling it. It'll let soldiers marry foreign women and bring them to America. I know it's crazy. I know we barely know each other. I know I'm supposed to be your enemy. But would you come to America? Yours, James. Leisel read it 3 times under the dim glow of a salvaged lamp. Her hands shook, the paper crinkled. Her throat burned with something between terror and hope. This wasn't a bar of soap or a cup of coffee. This was an invitation to abandon everything. Her language, her country, her identity, for an unknown future with a man she'd known for 5 months. A man who, by all rights, should have been her destroyer. They'll leave. You'll be left with nothing but shame. But James hadn't left. He'd written. He'd asked. Not demanded. Not presumed. Asked. Leisel stood and walked to her window, looking out over the ruins of Munich. Rubble stretched in every direction. The city she'd known was gone. The country she'd believed in had lied to her about everything, about the war, about the enemy, about what mattered. Franz was dead. Her father was dead. The Reich that promised them glory had delivered only ash. What did she have left to lose? She sat down with a pencil and a scrap of paper and began to write. Her English was halting, imperfect, but she formed each word with care. Dear James. Yes. When she finally sealed the envelope and carried it to the military postal station, she wasn't sure if it was love or surrender. Perhaps, she thought, they were the same thing now. The long journey. The War Brides Act passed on December 28, 1945. By then, Leisel had endured 3 months of interrogations designed to prove she wasn't a Nazi sympathizer. She'd answered questions about her family's party membership, her father had been registered but inactive, her wartime activities, factory work, nothing political, her motivations. She showed them James's letters, all 12 of them by then. The bureaucrats were merciless. One investigator asked her point blank, "Do you love this American, or do you just want to escape?" "Both," Leisel answered honestly. "Is that allowed?" In March 1946, she boarded a converted troop transport ship bound for New York. She carried a single suitcase containing 2 dresses, her mother's wedding ring, and a photograph of James in uniform. Around her, dozens of other German women clutched similar small possessions, their faces a mixture of excitement and dread. The voyage took 9 days. Leisel spent most of it on deck, watching the Atlantic swell and recede, trying to imagine a country she'd only seen in propaganda films, a place of plenty and cruelty, depending on which Reich official was speaking. When the ship pulled into New York Harbor on March 14, 1946, she saw him standing on the dock. James O'Donnell, no longer in uniform, wearing civilian clothes that made him look younger somehow. He held a bouquet of flowers instead of a rifle. She descended the gangplank on shaking legs. When she reached him, he handed her the flowers, daffodils, bright yellow against the gray morning, and said, "Welcome home." Home. The word felt foreign and familiar all at once. Years later, Kansas, 1954. The kitchen in Topeka was nothing like the bombed-out apartment in Munich. Sunlight streamed through gingham curtains. The smell of apple pie, her third attempt, finally successful, filled the air. Leisel, now 32 and a naturalized citizen, wiped her hands on her apron and turned to the documentary filmmaker who'd requested an interview for a project on war brides. "I came here as the enemy," she said slowly, her English now fluent but still colored by a German accent. "But everyone I meet teaches me that forgiveness is stronger than victory." Her daughter Emma, 4 years old, played on the floor with wooden blocks. She looked up at her mother's words, curious but uncomprehending. Emma had been born in America. She knew nothing of ruins or ration cards or propaganda posters. She only knew safety, plenty, and two parents who'd somehow found each other across an impossible divide. The filmmaker asked the question that everyone always asked: "When did you know you loved him?" Leisel considered. "I think," she said finally, "when he handed me that first cup of coffee. Not because of the coffee itself, but because he waited for me to take it. He didn't force it. Didn't demand anything in return. He just offered, and then he left. That's when I knew everything they'd told me was a lie." James came home from his job at the railway station that evening. He kissed Leisel's cheek, scooped up Emma, and asked about her day. It was ordinary, domestic, unremarkable, everything the war had tried to destroy. That night, after Emma was asleep, Leisel and James sat on their porch, watching fireflies blink in the Kansas twilight. "It was all a kind of mercy, wasn't it?" she said quietly. "The best kind, the kind we never deserved." James took her hand. "Maybe nobody deserves mercy. Maybe that's the point." Historians would later write that more than 14,000 German war brides became American citizens in those post-war years. Their marriages softened attitudes on both sides of the Atlantic, proving that even after the worst conflict in human history, individual acts of compassion could bridge chasms that treaties and declarations never could. The chocolate square James had first handed Leisel in Munich was a simple military ration. The apple pie she'd learned to bake in Kansas was a new life, one built on the ruins of the old, one that proved ideology could be dismantled by kindness, one gesture at a time. Leisel never forgot the taste of that first cup of bitter coffee in the ruins of her apartment. Decades later, when Emma asked if she'd loved Daddy when they were still enemies, Leisel told her daughter that love doesn't ask for permission from nations or politicians or propaganda ministries. "We were taught," she explained, "but kindness is stronger than hate. It's quieter, slower, but it wins in the end. Your father knew that before I did." The war had taught the world how to destroy cities, armies, futures. But a shared cup of coffee between two enemies had taught Leisel something more enduring: how to rebuild. Not just buildings or borders, but the harder architecture of trust. How to look at someone you'd been taught to fear and see, instead, simply another person trying to survive. That was the real victory. Not in battles or treaties, but in moments. A soldier's smile, a woman's acceptance, a child born into a world where yesterday's enemies could become today's family. The war ended in 1945. But Leisel's war, the internal one, fought between indoctrination and reality, ended on a cold spring day when a tired American boy offered her coffee and asked for nothing in return. Everything else followed from that single act of inexplicable, unauthorized, transformative mercy.